Hello and welcome back to Pharmacist Diaries, the podcast that reveals the secret lives of pharmacists, from where their journeys began, where they are now, and everything in between. I am your host, Anisha Patel, and today is the first day of 6 episodes from the Pharmacist Diaries Roadshow. We went to Great Ormond Street Hospital a few weeks ago to record multiple episodes with the pharmacy team, and today is the first episode of many. I am super excited to get this episode launched because I am so honored and lucky to have interviewed Steve Tomlin for this podcast. But before I introduce him, I just want to give a little bit of background information about the hospital itself. Great Ormond Street Hospital was built in 1852 and was the first pediatric hospital that opened its doors to children in the UK. In 1962, the hospital pioneered its first heart and lung bypass machine. How amazing is that? The hospital have conducted over 500 heart and lung transplants since then. It is the largest cardiac centre for children in the UK and one of the largest centres for heart transplantation in the world. How cool! Around 1967, the hospital led its first clinical trial of the rubella vaccination. After a year, around 110 children were vaccinated, and after 3 years, the vaccination was rolled out nationally. In the year 2000, the hospital launched the world's first gene therapy trial for children without functioning immune systems. There is so much to be proud of to work at this hospital, so it's really exciting that I get to launch this series for you guys. So let's talk about Steve. Steve is an extremely passionate, well-known pediatric pharmacist in the UK. He has over 30 years of experience within this field. He is the current director of the Children's Medicine Centre at the Great Ormond Street Hospital, following 3 years as their chief pharmacist. Prior to this, he was at the Evelina, where I work at the moment, and it's so unfortunate that our paths didn't cross at the time when he moved on to be chief pharmacist at Gosh. However, he worked there for a long time and was their lead pharmacist for many, many years. In 2007, he was the first pediatric pharmacist who became a consultant pharmacist, an epic moment for him and the rest of the pediatric pharmacists within the UK. For many years, he worked as a professional lead for the neonatal and pediatric pharmacist group, allowing him to advocate for pediatrics in national forums, at government level, within royal colleges, and within the media. On this episode, we don't just talk about Steve's career. We talk about this field and the excitement of working with pediatrics. We look at the challenges, we look at the opportunities, and we talk about why we love working with children. We also discuss the importance of the unique needs of pediatric patients and being comfortable with the uncomfortable, because you don't always have an answer. Steve's passion for his work is infectious, and he gives us true insight on how to be a successful pediatric pharmacist. If you are considering a career in pediatrics, you genuinely will not want to miss this episode. However, if you're not interested in pediatrics, but you want to hear a story about passion and purpose, you've come to the right place, friend. I can't wait to share this episode with you. Let's get started.
Well, excellent.
I can't believe I'm sitting in front of you, Steve. Like, this is an epic moment for my career and being able to have a conversation with you. So first of all, welcome to the Pharmacist Diaries podcast.
Thank you very much, and bless you for saying that.
Well, it is exciting. If you join the world of pediatrics, a lot of people know who you are. So we do get really excited. It's a shame that when I joined Evelina, it was only 4 years ago, you had obviously just moved on. So we didn't have the opportunity for our paths to cross, but here we are. I'm happy. I guess we'll kickstart today's episode by finding out why you wanted to become a pharmacist in the first place.
Oh, that's a good point. Trouble is, it was a very, very long time ago, and trying to remember back that far is intriguing. But there was something about, I liked science, and I liked law, and I liked people. And when I was doing one of those sixth form, what sort of career should you have, pharmacy popped up. So I didn't know any pharmacists, didn't know anybody in the career or anything. And I thought, have a look at that. And here I am. It was one of those. I thought, well, that looks pretty good, and so I went in and did it as my degree. I did spend a lot of my degree in the army. I was in the officer training corps, and so it was a bit strange, and probably I might have not got the balance quite right between how much time I spent with the army and how much time I spent studying. But I did come out with my pharmacy degree. And at one point I was going to join the forces as a pharmacist.
Oh, amazing.
But at the time there were only 7 pharmacists in the whole of the forces. And therefore the prospects weren't huge. So then I looked at actually joining and becoming a Royal Engineer in the forces. But eventually I thought, no, I'll give this pharmacy thing a go. And so I left Nottingham, having had the best 3 years of my life, possibly. And I came down to London to see where I could come and do my pre-reg. And here I am.
Why was it the best 3 years of your life?
I lived life to the full at university. I did work. I was there for most lectures. There are a few lines up through my notes as I fell asleep during some of them, and the pen just carried on up the page as I dozed off. But I was there for most of the lectures. Work hard and play hard, I think is the...
I was literally just going to say that. I was the same. I did 2 degrees, but in my first degree, when I did biology and chemistry, when I was living in America, it was a very work hard, play hard situation. But then when I moved back to the UK and did pharmacy, I became like really serious about, sticking to studying, attending everything, being on time, really organised, and on top of my game, because I just felt like I got it all out my system. So when you were at university, what kind of pathway did you think that you would go down in terms of pharmacy?
I actually didn't know, and so it seemed to fit with aspects of what I was, but I hadn't really thought about what the career was at the end of it. And it just so happened that I actually went out to Africa straight after my degree on a thing called Operation Raleigh, sort of a voluntary thing doing all sorts of things with rhino rescue and bits and pieces. And therefore, I wasn't too sure how to do my pre-reg, because most people started their pre-reg sort of after the summer. And I was in Africa until after Christmas. And so I thought, well, who is going to give me a pre-reg in the middle of the year? And I actually applied to community, and I couldn't get one at the time. And so I tried a couple of hospitals, and one said, well, we can't start it straight away, but we'll be happy if you come as a sort of an additional VAC student to see through one bit. And I started my pre-reg a year late. And in some ways, that was the beginning of everything, because I was the pre-reg who'd had the most experience when I started. I'd already been working there. And I started at a place called St Stephen's Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore. It's where Chelsea and Westminster now stands. And I was in there with part of the time with a building hat on, because they were knocking it down literally soon after I started. But we went to Westminster from there, and there was a place called Westminster Children's Hospital. And because I'd been around the longest out of the pre-regs, I was the first one to get sent over there. And my career has been paediatrics literally ever since. And so I was Westminster Children's Hospital, did a bit of care of the elderly and a bit of mental health. But on the whole, I stuck with paediatrics. And the first time a permanent post came up at Westminster Children's, I went for it and I got it. And I've literally been doing paediatric pharmacy ever since that point in time.
How many years has it been?
This was... I'm going to say the early 90s. So I was at uni 85 to 88. So I qualified in 90.
That's amazing. So when you were starting your journey, I was seven or 8 years old. I love that. That's incredible.
Yeah.
What is it about pediatrics that you love so much?
This sounds strange, but I think it was always the same right from the beginning, and it's almost what still intrigues me. Obviously, there's the children's and the parents, and I've got 4 of my own kids. My wife's a paediatric nurse. Kids are a big part of what I love. But it's also something about I'm not very good with black and white, and there's so much about paediatrics we don't know. There aren't licensed drugs for most of it, and therefore I like the greyness. I don't want to say we won't make it up as we go along, but there is that. I call it art as well as science coming together. It's, how do we find out what is the right dose to be giving? How assured are we? Some people like black and white, and if there isn't a black and white answer, don't like to be giving an answer. I think you've got to be a certain sort of person to like completely grey in something where there's somebody else's life on the end of it in some ways. But that makes it really exciting. And that excitement, almost for the same reason, has continued throughout the whole of my career. And I still get really excited about that unknown and that challenge.
Yeah, that. I do love peds for that. But like you said, with parents and children, there is a connection that I have in terms of education and counselling and empowering children to take medicines that I am in love with.
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's very different. It's a liaison with so many people to get your results, and I think that's really important. And the other bit with hospital with paediatrics, there's something about the staff. There's very little hierarchy within paediatrics, which seems to be there far more in the adult. I've done a little bit of adults, and they felt as if there was far more hierarchy. But whether you're a doctor, a nurse, and I think it's something about the way you have to talk to parents and children. The sorts of people who enjoy doing it are those sorts of people. It's and therefore it's a very friendly atmosphere generally.
100%. I remember as a resi, I mean, it's not even that long ago, it's a decade ago, when I used to go on ward rounds or go into different areas with adults, or even on-call situations where you have a consultant on the other side of the phone, it would be really scary. There were moments where you would be fearful about being assertive or having to say no to a supply, or being pressured into giving a medication that's completely non-formulary and you know that you're not supposed to do it, but the consultant's sort of pressurizing you at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's a drug that you're not familiar with and you feel really uncomfortable, or you're on ward round and you get quizzed by the consultant. It wouldn't be friendly quizzing.
No.
You would be put on the spot. It would be quite uncomfortable as a first year, qualified pharmacist. And you get none of that in peds.
No.
You don't. Everyone is so friendly. Everyone wants to be there for the patient. Everyone wants to go above and beyond for whoever they're looking after. And no question is, I don't have time. Hurry up and ask. It's, okay, yeah, what is it the pharmacy needs? Or, yeah, we love your input, completely understanding. I mean, I'm working in palliative care now at the Evelina, and
Excellent.
All the consultants are amazing people. And just watching them do their consultations and the language that they use with families and the way that they communicate and share information or even explain what they do as part of their role.
Yeah.
Because when they introduce themselves and they talk about palliative care, it can be really daunting for the family, potentially an unexpected diagnosis. And the way that they explain what they do or what they do as their role is it's incredible. Like when I did my IP course, I had to do a lot of shadowing. And I spent a lot of time going on home visits and being at Demelza, at the hospice, seeing different scenarios. I watched a compassionate extubation, and actually the grandma fainted on me and fell on the floor. Oh my God, it was intense. But I haven't experienced anything like this in adults in the same way that I do pediatrics. And I've only been doing it for 4 years, which is such a short space of time, but I can't imagine myself going back.
No, that's good, because I'm going to say it's real pharmacy. And this comes back to some of my lectures around being a pediatric pharmacist. There's so many unknowns. There's so many people that you need to liaise with, and half the time you don't know who you're liaising with, because often it's not the child directly, although you should always bring them into things, and therefore trying to work out what relationship everybody's got. It's a whole ball game, and you've got to understand pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. You've got to understand pharmaceutics if you're going to crush something. And therefore, I think every aspect. In fact, going back to university, there was actually a reason for going to university for doing pediatrics in some ways. If it's all there, going back to the black and white thing, if it's all there, you wonder why you went to university. But if you've got to challenge virtually everything, how is this? Then you've got to almost go back to some of the stuff that you learned and couldn't quite work out why you were learning at the time, but you do go back to it. And when you're chatting to the consultant, to the parents and things, you have to reflect on some of that, because if it was there black and whites, you're basically regurgitating to a certain extent, rather than having that sort of internal challenge as to, well, how am I going to explain this to you, and why aren't we 100% sure what we're doing? And that conversation, whether it's with a clinician at 12 o'clock at night because they've got you out of bed, or whether it's with a parent who wants to know, and then trying to, you've got somebody 7 or 8 year old who, in fact, you need to talk to as well, and you're talking to them all very differently about a topic that is not totally understood, but somebody needs to make a decision on. And I do think, as part of pharmacy's role is, if we're the drug experts, you do have to make a decision. And as you say, when you're just qualified and you're on call and you get those calls and you're put on the spot, it's still professionally yours to make a decision, and it's quite an ask, but exciting. If you don't get excited by that sort of thing, it's probably not the right thing to be doing. But you have to take an excitement from it, don't you?
There's sort of a problem-solving situation with every patient, which is, it makes the job interesting. Even for, students that are coming through Evelina for rotations, when you look at something as simple as excipients, like you said, you're using the knowledge from university and you are the expert and you get to share that. And like you said, it's not just looking at a resource and regurgitating information such as, hey, this is the creatinine clearance, this is what you've prescribed, this is what the BNF recommends. Please, can you alter the prescription from a safety point of view? The simple solutions that you have. When you think about a child, even within the one drug, there's multiple things to think about. And I love it when students come through our doors. Obviously, our VPP program's going on where international pharmacists are coming over. We've got someone from Sweden and Norway at the moment, and a German pharmacist coming at the end of the month. And it's so exciting to share what we do. And I feel really proud to be part of the team, because there is a lot of joy in sharing how we deal with our patients and what we can do for them. And it's really different to signing off a standard adult prescription for aspirin 75 milligrams or paracetamol 1 gram 4 times a day and furosemide 40 milligrams a day. Like you can sign it with your eyes, you can sign it with your eyes closed. Of course, people who are listening or watching, who are managing adult patients, it's not as simple as that. But there are a lot of patients where it can be.
Yeah, it's easy when you're talking to say, this is far better than adults. And why not if you've been a pediatric pharmacist all your life? But of course, the reality is it's not black and white between adults and pediatrics. Loads of adult stuff is unknown as well, and everything else. So it's not an us and them, but it's almost every prescription, and which is the unknown, which is why I've perhaps come onto this later in terms of research, but it's why almost the research agenda has stayed in my head the whole way through. You only have to look at paracetamol, probably the biggest drug ever used. Think about it in pediatrics, and there's still so much we don't know. And it doesn't matter what you touch, we don't know. But it does take me back to a reflection, going back to Westminster Children's Hospital, where I started, within pediatrics, and my boss then was a lady called Gul Roots, who unfortunately passed away not long ago. But she drew me into pediatrics, and then she actually went into the Department of Health afterwards. But she still had an absolute thirst for pediatrics. So we stayed in touch all the way through her career, having been apart for probably 30 years, but we stayed in touch on the pediatric front. And a lot of that liaison was why I ended up doing quite a lot with the Department of Health and other bits, because she drew me into that. But we knew nothing then in some ways. There were a couple of hospitals with fairly unvalidated formularies. And on my boss's desk then, there was a metal drawer with little cards in it. And therefore, if a prescription came down from ranitidine, you pulled out a card under R, ranitidine, 2 milligrams per kilogram. So all it said on it, didn't even say 3 times a day or twice. Just, and I'll always remember this one because I pulled it out, non-referenced, because there was no BNF. There was no standard text for pediatrics. And so there was a drawer and a card for each main drug that we used with a dose on it.
I wonder if that drawer still exists.
I should have kept it, I must admit, because I was there when it all got knocked down again. And I should have borrowed and looked after some of those things. But it really does make you think how much things have moved on. And going back to that time, from a government point of view, the use of unlicensed medicines was not acknowledged. And that's why there was no, the fact that people were using drugs outside of license was not acknowledged. And there was a lot of discussion at the time. And it was through a lot of that national lobbying and everything that a book called Medicines for Children first came out, which was the pre-runner to the BNF for children, which as a group of fanatical pediatric pharmacists, we sort of pulled together because we had to, and it was almost when the BNF for children came out that there had to be an acknowledgement at government level as to what pediatrics was really doing. I think everyone knew it was happening, but it wasn't acknowledged that it was happening, and nobody wanted to look at it. Obviously, that then got looked at, and that in some ways moved into things like the pediatric regulation at the EMA, where the industry have to look at pediatrics as part of their license submission. So it's been an interesting career in terms of a time of change, and all sorts of things got set up. My career started just before the Neonatal and Pediatric Pharmacist group got set up, which is the body of bringing together pediatric pharmacists. There was nothing before that. And so it's been an interesting time. I sort of came at the beginning of the push for pediatrics, and it's been really exciting, and has developed.
The group that we've got at MPPG is amazing. The community that you have, and the help and the support, and the just willingness for people to share information and help each other is amazing. And I went to the Clinical Pharmacy Congress, obviously you were there, and I met new pediatric pharmacists that I've not met before. And it's like you know each other already. It's really weird, but amazing.
It is. It got criticised at one point about almost being too cliquey. And we would look at internally, we were thinking, well, we don't know half the people. These are people we've just met as well. And you say, as soon as you meet somebody, it feels as if you've known them forever. There's an attachment somehow within pediatrics. And so people were assuming that everybody knew everybody else and they were the outsider. But in fact, these were all people from outside. And as soon as you start chatting, you get to know people really, really quickly. It might go back to that thing I was talking about, the people who get into pediatrics are a certain sort of person. I don't know, but it is very friendly. I wasn't there at the inaugural one because I was obviously far too young at that point in time, which was a part weekend up in Edinburgh. But I've been to every conference since, which must be about 28 years of conferences, and I haven't missed any. And still expected to try and do a knee slide on the dance floor during Guns N' Roses on the Saturday night. Whether I can stand up again off the dance floor after I've done it is obviously becoming a slight issue. But it's a very friendly conference. And as you say, people want to be there. I've been to so many conferences where people go disappearing for quite a lot of the sessions, that they go off to the shops and or a bit of sightseeing. Whereas at MPPG, most people are there for virtually the whole thing. And it is because they want to be there at the sessions and actually learn what's being said. And I think that's a real testament, one, for the people who are doing pediatrics, and two, for the conference in some ways. But there is a genuine desire to understand more about all the stuff we don't know, either because industry hasn't done the work, or therefore you're reliant on people. What have you done before? We're doing this. Have you done it as well? There's nothing like a bit of backup from somebody else saying they're doing the same thing as you, and that's, I guess, what a lot of that networking is all about. So really enjoyed my neonate and pediatric pharmacist group career. Very strangely, very early on in my career, I said decided they wanted a permanent person pulling together some stuff. And I volunteered, and I think I was doing half a day a week from very early on in my career. And that has continued. And I still do an awful lot of that stuff. And it sort of led me into a lot of the sort of national stuff that I get involved with, and lots of lobbying and guidelines and all these sorts of things. And it's sort of where I've come into it. It's changed the way I think about where I work as well. So whether it's at the Evelina, where I was for 20 years, or Great Ormond Street, I almost don't do anything internally that I think is not worth doing nationally. And I very much work like that. Well, if we're doing this here, everybody must need to do this sort of thing. It's because if we're thinking this hard about it, then probably everybody else is. And it's almost a side of my career that's sort of gone on from very, very early on. That sort of, well, let's share, or let's get everybody else in and see what everybody else thinks. Because if we're going to talk about it here, we might as well talk about it on a wider scale so that everybody understands. Obviously, there's so much that could happen with, and it's not possible to do lots of things. But I have always tried to do that side of things, and I guess it's where a lot of the Tony Nunn was a big mover and shaker in the setup of the MPPG, and I think it's how he has always worked. And he was God as the pediatric within pediatric pharmacy, and I learned a lot from him. And he's still he's retired, but he's still very active, and you need a few key people for that. It's not for everybody, sort of getting involved with, I'm going to say, politics with a small p, and politics with a big P. I do spend quite a lot of time lobbying in Parliament as well, but that's it's a different side of what needs to be done. If we need to have a different look at commissioning of medicines for children, if we need to say, well, we need more licensed drugs, if we need to say, we're going to standardise this needs to be done nationally, and then we need those drugs procured, somebody's got to lead it somewhere. And so it needs a few people at the top end, because it can't all be done from within a trust. And so it's been a really interesting side to my career, which I've really, really enjoyed.
It's amazing that you've been advocating for children all this time, and
just old. That's what I just been around a long time.
I guess a couple of questions. How did you get involved with sort of pushing yourself into Parliament and advocating for children? Like, if someone was relatively newly qualified and thinking about going into a pediatric specialty, and they're really enjoying the clinical areas, but they also want to advocate for children, how could they get involved with the things that you do?
There's two sides to that bit in my mind. I was at a meeting at the RPS last week to do with credentialing and consultant pharmacists. And And for my sins, I was the first paediatric consultant pharmacist to go through. But now I think I do too much management, and probably not sure if I can totally say I'm a consultant pharmacist anymore, but via the RPS sort of system. But it's a system I totally believe in. And there was a bit of a discussion there, and David Webb was there, and so many people were saying, how did you plan out your career? It was a bit of, and virtually everybody talked about having a bit of a strategy, but almost more importantly, grabbing what you saw and what was in front of you. And I think, to answer your question, I think that's probably the key. It's, if somebody suggests that, and you're interested in things and there's an opportunity of getting involved with something, then get involved. It's something like the MPPG where you get involved. And if someone talks about a project or there's a position on the committee or something, you get involved. Or if there's a speciality that you're really involved within, you say, well, we need a special interest group in this. You set up your own group within the MPPG. All of those things enable you to network in a different way, to be understood as a name, and there is quite a lot in a name. I'm going to sit here and say, I'm not the best paediatric pharmacist in the world. I'm probably might be one of the best known within the UK. Again, probably because I've just been around a long time. But that doesn't mean I know a lot of stuff. A lot of people probably know a lot more than I do. But putting a name out there and getting it known enables you to talk to others in a way that perhaps if your name's not known, you can't do. And it was, when we were looking at credentialing, so before the consultant pathway was even, there was a thing called the College of Pharmacy Practice. And they were doing a bit of credentialing. And when the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain split up into a regulator, that disappeared. But we thought, well, hold on, we should do this in paediatrics. So within the MPPG, we said, let's form a group within the College of Pharmacy Practice. And I became the first chair of the faculty within the College of Pharmacy Practice. And it's about putting yourself out there. Anyone could advocate for paediatrics, and you have to start at a local level, and being an advocate for paediatrics in your home territory is the right thing to do. But myself and a chap who's now, I think, one of the lead pharmacists over the whole of North Island in New Zealand, we used to say, well, why haven't we got paediatric-specific community pharmacies? And we started looking at that. And we were going to set up some of our own community pharmacies purely dedicated to paediatrics. And you thought, if you were a parent...
That's exciting.
Exactly. Wouldn't you want to go there?
I'm just thinking, actually, yeah, why haven't we done that?
Why haven't we done it? And I still haven't done it. And like so many things, I have ideas, and some of them come off, and some of them you manage to work through, and some don't. And you can't be afraid of not achieving everything. It's... People talk about what will they leave behind. I don't think you ever know, and it doesn't matter what your expectation. You will never, if you're somebody who drives and wants to be sort of involved in getting all sorts of things done. The trouble is, more and more ideas will keep coming to your mind. So I am fairly sure when I get to the end of my career, I will still be thinking of all the things that I haven't yet achieved and yet want to. But hopefully there will always be the next generation. And that is, you talked about sort of teaching and, that whole aspect that you were talking about down at the Evelina in terms of the master classes and the internships. I was obviously, I was the lead down there when all that got set up, and we just thought it was the right thing to do.
It's so amazing. It's so good.
But should it be bigger than just happening at the Evelina? And the answer is almost certainly yes. And therefore you could argue it's amazing, but it hasn't achieved its full potential yet and all sorts of things, and everything can just carry on growing. And I think if you carry on, if you think like that, then you will drive and you will always go. You will go places. Again, you might leave behind some of the other stuff that you love. I miss now. I've gone on a career through being clinical pharmacist, including residency and all these sorts of things, to being a consultant pharmacist, and very much sort of that clinical advocate, then to a chief pharmacist, and now to a director of Children's Medicine Centre. Becoming a chief pharmacist, whilst I had every intention of staying a bit clinical, just the day job didn't really allow that. And do I miss that? Yes. And you cannot do everything. And you're either happy moving from one thing to another, or you stay with a career pathway and sort of hang on to the one bit you love. So there's no right or wrong in any of this. It's and part of it is what you fall into, and part of it a bit like, I did fall into pharmacy, and I did fall into pediatrics. I would never change any of that, and I think it's been an amazing career. But I'm talking as if I've just about finished it, haven't I? But
don't announce that you're retiring on this podcast.
Well, so my wife is retiring, and
Okay.
so it's being discussed in terms of she wants to retire, and I've always thought I probably never will. At some point, everyone will be fed up with me and just throw me out, probably. But it's one of those things. I think if you've got an absolute passion for what you do, you probably never really want to retire, and even if you retire, you probably don't quite disappear.
Isn't there beauty in pharmacy because there is so much variety? And you talk about, I guess, transitioning from a very clinical role, because that's, most of the time that's where you start and build your foundation in terms of what you want to do. A lot of pharmacists go down the clinical pathway and absolutely love it and kind of never leave. They end up doing some form of leadership, management, education and training. It all fits into the portfolio, doesn't it? And it's expected. It's part of the role. But it's actually quite hard to make that transition between saying, I'm very clinical and actually I'm going into that chief pharmacist role and I know I have to step away. And it's really hard. But at the same time, you know that you're creating a whole new host of skills. You're getting experience in a different side of pharmacy. And it's really enjoyable that you've got that option. You're not stuck in kind of like one role. I'm doing education and training at the university. I'm doing pediatrics, but I'm specializing in palliative care. I've got this podcast, so I'm advocating for students and young people all the way. And who would have thought that I started this journey with, my husband helped me with a couple of microphones and kind of doing it virtually. And then we've moved from audio to video. By the time this series comes out, I will have reached 100 episodes, which is hundreds of hours of content. And that's just exploring, like being adventurous, trying new things, being innovative, creative, and not being afraid of failing along the way, because you'll always learn from it. And that's kind of what I try to put across in the podcast all the time, that it's okay to try new things and it's okay for them to not be perfect, but you're progressing. And like you said with the masterclass, because I have to go back to that, because now I'm sort of responsible for that and the BPP, and I love it. It's a major part of my role at Evelina alongside palliative care. And we have transitioned, because of COVID, we went online. And the virtual got us, 3 times the amount of pharmacists joining, which again was a step in the right direction. Of course, we want people to come and visit us. Of course, we're so proud to have people come to the Evelina and show them around the wards, show them what we're doing, get them involved with drug histories and medicines reconciliation.
Hands-on.
It's so much more fun. But when you can reach the masses, there is some joy with being able to reach that international network, especially because other countries have not come as far as us in the UK in terms of what clinical knowledge and expertise that we have. And they are so excited to learn that there is joy in being able to be part of that journey. And it is a really exciting area to be in. And And I want young people to see how amazing pediatrics is. And part of this series that I'm doing is showcasing what we're all doing and getting more people involved. What I'm so sad about is that at university, they have you have to breathe, 1 3-hour seminar. And that's it.
Well,
It
I
makes
don't
me
think
so
I had
sad.
any when I went. So obviously going back even further, and
We need to change that immediately because it's just not enough and people don't get the exposure. And then they don't really know what it's about and they come to our ward areas and it's quite overwhelming. There is so much to think about. And like you said, if you can't see outside of the black and white and live in that nice grey area that we enjoy, it's very difficult to see yourself in this specialist area.
it is. I think there's a worry that if you do pediatrics, you don't know about adults. But for those who are listening, pediatrics goes up to 18, 19, and depending on where you work and how the structure works, sometimes it's young adults as well, up to 25. And therefore, you don't do care of the elderly, obviously, but you do cover adults. Some of the conditions are different, but you have to understand drugs from somebody who's 0.5 kilos up to 150 kilos. And that's exciting. I always say, pediatrics, 200 time variance on weight. Adults is 3. And we wonder why some things go wrong sometimes, or we don't get things right because of the doses and all sorts of things. Huge variance. And then some of the kinetics are different than everything else. Therefore, doing pediatrics, usually you understand quite a lot about adults as well. And I think, it's not so segmented that you shouldn't think, well, if I've got to decide it's pediatrics or, early on, it's pediatrics or it's adults. If you do pediatrics, a great sort of background to adults. But once you've done pediatrics, you'll never actually want to leave. And that's, I think that's the important bit, really, really important. But that teaching, very exciting. The fact that we know so many people in the UK as well, but certainly internationally, don't do clinical pharmacy the way we do. I'm actually just on the train coming here today. I'm marking somebody's thesis for their PhD is about introducing clinical pharmacy in Hong Kong for pediatrics, and I'm the external reviewer on their PhD, and really exciting to read how they've looked at it. And I think going back to you never stop learning. You've got to have and even as a teacher, I think the more learning mind you've got, the better teacher you are. I.e., you critique virtually everything that's coming. And I spend far more of my time now. I used to do a lot of teaching at university. I spend more of my time now evaluating people's papers and PhDs. But again, it's still a learning journey. I learn more by evaluating them than I probably do put into actually to reviewing them, because people look at things in such different ways. It's a fascinating career, and there's no right or wrong. There's so many fields. Pediatrics are obviously across everywhere within that: secondary care, primary care, tertiary care. Great Ormond Street has been quite a revelation in some ways. I mean, I've been pediatrics in London virtually all my life. Coming to Great Ormond Street, it's a hyper-specialised place. It's not, in my mind, not a children's hospital almost. I don't think I've heard asthma mentioned since I arrived. It is rare diseases. It's a rare disease centre. And therefore it's another bit, and it is a national centre for rare diseases. And so, there's no right or wrong. You've so many things that you can get involved with. I was primarily neonates as a clinical pharmacist, and then PICU in my sort of later days. But neonates has always been what's fascinated me. And therefore, even within pediatrics, so many subsets, so many things, so many places to go and work. You can do more research. I'd have to sit here now, in hindsight of my career, saying, always do research, stay involved with research, just evaluating a paper so you know whether, when a consultant says, should I or shouldn't I use this, to be able to evaluate a paper better than he can or she can is actually a really good skill, because you can go back, well, and that's what discussing medicines is about. Not your consultant saying, I fancy this, and and as a pharmacist saying, well, let me go and see if I can find it. It's a case of, well, statistically, I'm not sure it's the right thing for that patient. And it's having that challenge back. And that's when life becomes very exciting, I think, as a clinical pharmacist. And to be able to do that, you've got to be good at research. You've got to understand statistics and all these sorts of things. Doesn't mean you've got to be running clinical trials the whole time, but you've certainly got to understand the whole research element. And if you're doing research and if you are breaking new ground, well, the one thing you've got to be doing is education, because other people have got to know about it. And so teaching, and that can be fairly broad and general because we know so much more than others, or it can be groundbreaking sort of a way forward. This is new, and I think everybody needs to know about it. It almost goes back to that bit about why did I do pharmacy, and there was that science, that law, and people, and all of these bits sort of bring all of that together. Pharmacy is not one thing, and the fact that the pharmacy world is still known generally as a supplier of medicines, obviously really important, but so much more. It's almost the bread and butter bit that has moved on in practice. Good clinical pharmacy is a totally different beast, and still being worked out as to where it fits in, particularly as everyone comes through as prescribers and all these sorts of things. So I think it's going to be really, really exciting for the future. But again, we've got to grasp it, because nurses are starting to prescribe, we're prescribing, others are prescribing. Who's doing what? Do we need as many doctors? Big challenge. Or should they be doing something else? Should we be doing all the prescribing? And if something's highly specialised from hospital, well, why are they coming back for a clinic with the consultant, really for a repeat prescription? Pharmacy could do all that, very easily, and probably better placed for doing it, to be honest. So I think the exciting thing for me about pharmacy is the fact that it is so varied. The world's your oyster. And these podcasts, absolutely amazing. I do remember spending a whole day in a booth doing radio interviews purely around paracetamol. And you sort of think, have I got, and I did my media training for that. One of the best things I ever did, how to put in a strap line to every sentence you've got. And the fact that providing you can make an entertaining story, you won't get ripped apart by the person who's interviewing you, because at the end of the day, they're just trying to find a story. And I think that's, just those little nuggets that you get from that bit of training, I have sort of always in the back of my mind when I'm talking to very different people, particularly outside of the profession, and thinking, well, it's about the way you deliver something far more than almost what it is you're delivering to make a statement and get a message out there. So yeah, it's been fascinating, and I've loved it.
We are very fortunate, aren't we? And you're totally advocating for pharmacy in general, which is lovely. And I guess I should take you back to your journey. We've talked a lot, actually, and amazing topics have come up. When you first started at Westminster Children's Hospital, as it was known, what were your initial thoughts on what specialist area that you wanted to go down? So you've mentioned that you like neonates. What else were you interested in?
So the first career was a split, actually, because we served a mental health hospital. So I was 50-50 between pediatrics and mental health. And I did love mental health. Lots of the same issues in terms of lots of unknowns, particularly at that time. There was a huge amount of unknowns. I think neonates, part of it is the people you meet. I got on with the neonatal crew there a lot, but I mean, we had BMT and all sorts of things there as well. But it was neonates which, there was something fascinating about neonates, the premature neonates. And bearing in mind when that was, the abortion age and the age of keeping babies then was 28 weeks. Now we're at 24, and we know we can keep them 23, 22. And the statistics for survival and long-term problems are the same now for a 24-weeker as they were for a 28-weeker then. Therefore, it's been a field that has been developing, and huge changes. Surfactant came out when I was a pre-reg. You can imagine, surfactant absolutely was probably one of the primary things. Two things I think changed neonates. Maternal steroids and surfactant. They have revolutionized, but of course, by revolutionizing who you can save, it's also meant that you've got babies that are even less developed that you now have got an obligation to keep alive, and therefore the intensive care side of it and what we know about drugs and how they're metabolized or not metabolized. And I think it's all of that side of thing. I've just been fascinated all the way through with neonates. I wouldn't say, I've done all sorts of pediatrics all the way through, but there's been a fascination with neonates. And there's no badges within pharmacy to say that I'm a pediatric pharmacist. There's not much branding. You're self-named in some ways. And if someone was going to ask me, I would say I was a neonatal pharmacist, but I'm a pediatric pharmacist by trade. But I'm a pharmacist by trade, through and through. Some of the stuff you advocate for, in terms of where I've got to, has gone. It accounts, a lot of it is around sort of unlicensed medicines and trials. Well, that's in adults as well. So it's not all been pure pediatrics. Some things sort of overarch all of those. But neonates has always been my little thing.
And that's the exciting part of this journey, is that in pediatrics, we're always growing, we're always learning, we're always doing that research to try and make life easier and better for our cohort of patients. And that is also part of the, excitement of being in this field. You're always learning, always.
Yeah.
And there's always the unknown, but the nice thing about being in the hospital, and especially for me at Evelina, is you've got lots of other very experienced pharmacists within your team. And I love it when I ask Will questions, because he's obviously been there for 28 or 9 years now.
Yes, one of my first members of staff.
Yeah, so whenever I'm fearful of something, or it's unknown, or I just don't know where to start or where to look, he's just like, yeah, it's fine. I've seen that 25 times. And he just gives you that reassurance, because he's been there for so long. And that experience it's a safety net.
It is.
In the workplace.
And people who are practicing alone, they might not have the numbers or the complexity of some of the big centres, but in some ways demanding in a very different way. And this is where, going back, the networking and the supporting and the education for others. Because if you're a lone paediatric pharmacist, you've got 2 or 3 wards, and it's you and maybe a technician or something like that. There's some big decisions to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's nobody to look around to. And so there's pros and cons of different setups, and they all bring their own challenges, and I think it's really important. But I think what's interesting, you talked about N=1 there. You get a paper. The model of what we know with personalised medicine, i.e. something we've been talking about for ever with pediatrics, because in some ways we personalise every dose already. There's something new coming onto that, things like genomics and things like that. But every dose we have to think about, well, what is the dose and how old are they, and all these sorts of things. Some of that's going to come to adults. So it's not only the pharmacokinetics might be roughly the same, but their pharmacogenomics might not be. And so they might all need a different dose as well. And so some of the things that we've been dealing with pediatrics for years is going to become more and more heightened for adults. And I've been the last few years of lectures, I've been talking about the difference between what evidence is. We've always liked randomized controlled trials, because that's the proof of everything we ever wanted to know. And that is evidence-based medicine. If you've got a good randomized controlled trial, then you've got some good evidence-based medicine. With everything being cut down into smaller and smaller cohorts, which generally virtually all of pediatrics is, you can't do randomized controlled trials. And therefore, we've got to get used to N equals 1 in a different way. And this is where sort of real world data, and I practiced evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. And it is practice-based evidence, stuff that we do. We need to think of a better way of capturing it. So if you are the first or just the second person, we've got to think of how do we capture that so that we are building up the data set, because no one's ever going to be able to run a trial on it. And that's exciting as well, a very different way of thinking about what does make good evidence and how are we going to practice in the new world of, if we understand that, well, even in adults, they don't all want the same dose, or pediatrics, we know they don't all want the same dose. And somehow we've got to look at the way we look at data and evidence, and a whole new field that's coming in, modelling. There's all sorts of clever bits of data out there, so you can do modelling without using the patient. If you get a few blood samples and you do a load of modelling to work out what dose they might or might not want. It's an ever-changing world, and medicines will always be changing. Certainly, one of the things I'm looking at the moment is 3D printers, and you can just imagine. And you have to picture this. You've got your child at home, and they're asleep, and you move their thumb over, you put it on a little scanner, and it tells you what their blood levels are and what's happening with their kinetics and everything, and it tells you what dose they're now supposed to be. That connects to a little 3D printer next to it. You've been to your pharmacy. You've got a little bucket full of the polymer that's got the drug in it, and your 3D printer prints out the dose that they're supposed to be on for the next dose. Sorted. The new way of thinking about medicines. Don't need liquids anymore because you just have the exact dose, and we know no one can measure the right doses and all these sorts of things. You have the exact dose come out of your 3D printer next to your bed. Sorted. I might well be dead and buried before all this actually happens, but it's exciting to think about, and it'll come out chewable and in the shape of their favourite animal and the right colour and everything else, because it can.
Your big ideas. I can already see like your brain kind of like twirling with how can we make this happen now? And I love that. It's really exciting. And your passion comes through. The energy is there, and it's great to have this conversation with you. Just because it's inspiring to be with someone who has got this much experience and is so passionate about pediatrics. I love that. So yeah, it's a pleasure. When you talk, I guess when you look at kind of research, I wanted to ask you actually about the formulary at the Evelina, because when we talked a little bit about being on your own as a pediatric pharmacist, so if you're working in a district general hospital, you might not have that team of pharmacists around you. So I worked in Stoke Mandeville. I was the senior pharmacist. I had a band 7 who rotated with me. And then we had band 6 pharmacists also doing shorter rotations. But if there was the unknown, especially when you had metabolic patients, for example, coming through A&E, you have no one to turn to in that moment, or you feel like you have no one to turn to, because at the moment I feel very supported. I've got a safety net of lots of people, and it's not just pharmacists. You've got nurses, you've got doctors around you who are very, very supportive with helping you to find the information that you need to answer the question that you've got. I relied on the Evelina formulary a lot when I was working in District General, and I think there's also kind of two bits here. One is I know that Pat actually told me that you spend a lot of time on the formulary and you used to stay up very late at night updating it. And I wanted to tell you how far we've come with the formulary now, because obviously it's online. I was tasked with, I guess, transforming what we've got at the moment and pushing the project forward. So developing a project management app, which allowed lots of people to impact what we're doing with that app. So now all the pharmacists or pediatric pharmacists within Southeast London, depending on the specialist area they have. So we've got people at King's obviously supporting us with any drugs that relate to the liver. We've got the Brompton now supporting us with a lot of respiratory work and cardiology as well. We've created a little family. And again, it's just this network and this community that everyone wants to come together. Now, don't get me wrong, engaging everyone was hard because
Yes.
everyone is busy and everyone has lots to do. And I'm just giving them more work because in the beginning, when I got into that role, there was unfortunately around 3 years worth of emails in the pediatric formulary email address that had not been attended to. So I literally listed them all on paper. And then I transferred them on to this project management app. And I was like, Nana, this cannot be done within our own team. This is a lot of work and it's going to overwhelm people once I start delegating these tasks to all the specialist pharmacists. And thankfully, she saw bigger than what I did and helped me to get a group of people involved. And now those meetings are happening every month and people are really trying their best to contribute. We have created, instead of using a Word document for the formulary application forms, it's all become electronic now. And as soon as you fill it in, it creates a task for you on the app. It's amazing. But I do know
The wonders of technology.
Yeah, that you spent a lot of time on that late at night updating it on your own. And I guess recording evidence or knowing things from your experience on the wards and within the pharmacy, and keeping it up to date for other people to use. I guess, what was your experience with that?
I mean, it existed before I arrived. There was a version of the formulary when I first arrived. I think it was edition 3 or 4. Edition 1 never got published. I think that was, so I was aware of it. I think in paper copies we got to version was 8, my last one before it went electronic. I think it was hard to. Good on you is what I'm going to say. It's trying to keep that practical and correct. And so I've worked with a number of formularies. I mentioned Medicines for Children, which we tried to create as the national formulary, and we got all sorts of people, and we did 2 versions of that. Neither version ever went live without errors in, and these were big national, books. Which is why eventually we decided we can't do that, and we jumped into bed with the BNF, and the BNF for Children came out. But none of those have ever been quite practical enough, and I think that was always the bit about the Evelina formulary. The Order Hay had the ABC at one point. When the BNF came out, they stopped theirs. But it's a challenge, an absolute challenge, and I can't take all the credit. The team at the Evelina were there. Sarah and Will, big parts of trying, and I'm going to use that word solely, trying to keep it vaguely up to date, correct, and it's not until you put something into practice. Proofreading is a nightmare, and pagination. So that the dose doesn't end up on the next page. Therefore, there's a chance of getting it wrong because only part of it's on one page. Therefore, we need to lose one word so that line can move up so it all comes onto one page. All of that was, it took forever. But it's not until you start using it in practice, you sort of think, hold on, there's a gap there. Well, what about that? We've almost missed an age group because of the way it's been written. And there was so much of that all the way through. You know, when something's been built over such a long period of time in some ways, because you work out, hold on, we should do them all like this. And back in those, then trying to work how to find every drug with it in a slightly different way, and so the way it's all put. But we wanted to keep it going. You know, it became the only published sort of hands-on formulary, I suppose, and I guess that was why we kept it going. Interestingly, when the BNF for children did first get launched, there was and it was a joint publication between the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health and the Neonatal and Pediatric Pharmacists Group and the BMJ. We had a big press release, and Princess Anne was the patron who came to see the launch of the BNF for children, and I was in line with my badge saying that I worked at the Evelina Guys and Tommies, and I utmost respect for the way the briefing of the royal family at that point. She came along the line, she got to me, shook my hand, and said, "You've got the other paediatric formulary, haven't you?" Which was quite, her briefing was quite incredible, and therefore I'm always wary when I'm talking to how much they've been briefed and what they know. But there was a big bit when the BNF for children came out as to whether we stopped doing it. But the BNF, a formulary is many things. One is a list of drugs. One is a list of drugs with doses, and one has got practical top tips on how you use things. And it almost changed the way we looked at it a little bit in terms once the BNF was there. But it still felt as if there was a need for a bit more of a hands-on. Obviously, it doesn't have all drugs in it, therefore doesn't work for everybody, because a drug that they're using might not be in it. Whereas the BNF, of course, not everything's in it, but a lot of stuff is in it. A lot more drugs. But that was almost the decision at that point. We still think there is a load of practical stuff in here that we believe we need at the Evelina, and therefore others might need as well.
Absolutely.
And so that was the drive to carrying on. It was a lot of hard work, and not just from me. And there were a few clinicians who got very involved with it as well, and we were proud of it.
Evelina is still very proud of it, and
exactly.
It's still going.
I think that's important. And coming back to somewhere like Great Ormond Street, although whilst a lot of the stuff is rare diseases and things, and so that if you're in MI, they will have access to it. And I think it's important when you haven't got 100% pure evidence base. Therefore, this is the definitive answer. What you need are 2 or 3 things, which you can then look at. And if they all line up, well, that's great, because hopefully that's the answer. If they don't line up, then you've got a question. But that question obviously allows you to look at it in a bit more detail. If you've only got one thing, and there was a particular pediatric formulary from Australia which sort of got this. It was, and how can I put it? It's a bit like if I sat down and just wrote down every dose that I thought was right, and put them all down in a book and then said, right, this is the formulary. Well, hopefully most of that is right. I'm not sure it would. I'm hoping most of that would be right. But what's the guarantee? What's the assurance and everything else? And of course, and going back to publishing that, there was always, after publication, something we found that we thought, have I lost sleep over the years because of that? Yes. It's a frightening time at the point of publication. Have we found everything? And I'm glad it's with you now. It was really challenging, but I think it was the right thing to do, and I'm glad it's still there.
I think part of the drive and motivation from my point of view and the enjoyment of working on the formulary is knowing that there are hundreds of people using that on a day-to-day basis. So you want to keep it up to date, and you want to make sure that there is evidence base behind what's on there. Because at the end of the day, if people are using those dosages on their patients, you feel quite responsible.
Oh, yes.
And that can be it's quite scary, actually. But
Very scary.
We're doing our best to make sure it's kept up to date.
And almost the more you think about it, the worse it is in some ways. Advice from me to you on this: don't think about it too hard, because you won't sleep ever again, because it is a huge accountability.
Yeah, I think as I've worked at Evelina, I'm working in palliative care, I'm understanding a lot more about patient transition between our hospital and primary care. And for my specialty, GPs tend to see a palliative care patient and a pediatric one maybe once in their career, from what the statistics show. So when they see a symptom management plan, they automatically freak, and it is quite scary and it is quite overwhelming, and they don't know what to do. And a lot of them actually start refusing. And we've got patients that are 4 to 5 hours away. And the first thing that comes to my mind is no, they're not coming back to Evelina. They need to get this medication in their local area. We do not need them to be traveling to pick up something that a GP can potentially prescribe. And it used to frustrate me all the time. But now I'm trying to sort of alter my mindset and think how we can actually improve the education for those GPs and the education within primary care with regards to the specialist area that I'm working in. And also, one of the beauties of being in pediatrics and within these kind of niche areas is when it comes to research and evidence, education and training, you can get involved with things that I guess maybe in the adult world you might not do until you're at a band 8A level very early on. There's the Association of Pediatric Palliative Medicine. We've created a pharmacist group, and it's not just in England, it's international. We all have each other's email addresses. We're all relying on each other for support. We're getting involved with creating national guidelines. We're updating the palliative care formulary, and all of that, it plays a part in what I do in my day job. It's helping me to learn, it's helping me to grow as a pharmacist in this specialist field, but it's also helping me to create that network and actually be part of a very rewarding team of people, because it's not just pharmacy. There's consultants, there's nurses, and we help each other. We do education sessions for nurses all the time, and I really enjoy that. And I really like sharing the knowledge that I've got and the experience that I have. And whenever trainee pharmacists come to the Evelina, they choose to spend time with me. They choose to come with me to palliative care to see what my role is like, and that really excites me. And I'm really enjoying it. And I really want to encourage more people to come into this area. And I hope, obviously, that this podcast episode and all the other episodes makes people think that this is a really exciting area to be in, and they should come join us.
Definitely.
I guess time is, we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half, which is very exciting. I want to ask you, I guess, one last question is that, in the future, if you could see one thing change, revolutionize pediatrics, what would it be?
To revolutionize pediatrics? I suppose the thing that would change pediatrics in a way that would make it safer, let's put it that way, is licensing. We're still at a situation where for every drug that gets licensed, only 14% of them get licensed for pediatrics. And even after 10 years, that's only up to 25%. And therefore, a lot of what we've been talking about is that working behind a license. I might be licensing adults, but not for pediatrics. That makes it a real unknown. There's a safety issue and a different way of working because of that with so many things. the license isn't everything, therefore it's evidence. There's so much we don't know, and using something in somebody who's 3 months or 3 years or 15 years is different. The data is different, the outcomes are different, the handling is different, and therefore, so much is needed to know. And I guess it's why, probably for I'm going to say the last phase of my career, I have sort of created the Children's Medicine Centre with a hope that we can start digging away at more of the evidence base around medicines. And that's pharmaceutics, pharmacology. It's all of that, use of real world data, because it's the one thing which, and you'll know this from palliative, there is so much we don't know, and therefore it's the evidence in some ways. So what would change pediatrics drastically is that evidence base. And an understanding, perhaps, within the pharmacy world of how you talked about people falling into things sort of earlier in their career or having to deal with. Maybe it depends how you want to look at it. In some ways it's lovely. In other ways, well, should we be looking at it that early? The criticality of it, the complexity of it is the same as adults. So why are we enabling more junior pharmacists to be doing stuff that maybe in adults they wouldn't? And there is still a bit of, pediatrics is just another clinical speciality, a bit like doing renal. And of course it's not. It's a quarter of the population, and absolutely every speciality that there is in adults is a speciality within pediatrics. The neonates are separate. They haven't got those premature neonates. And then you've got fetal medicine, i.e. things which aren't there at all. And so it's a huge field, which is, from a professional point of view, I think is still misinterpreted. So if you've got a pediatric ward, well, you need a pediatric pharmacist, but all of those, they will all be different specialities. And so there's that understanding that pediatrics is, there is no such thing as pediatrics, you could argue. It's a bit like just saying adults, and I think that pharmacy world has got its head around the fact you just can't say, I do adults. On the whole, within secondary care, anyway, it is split into specialities. And pediatrics needs to be seen like that. And if we develop the workforce like that, then the way people, I'm going to say, sort of look into the topics that they're looking at will be more sort of probing, and that's where your research comes from. That's where your answers come from. And so we're lacking workforce, you could argue. So there's two things here, but maybe one leads to the other, is we need a greater workforce. Just because you've only got 3 patients, because the numbers are different. We haven't got the same number of patients, and that's probably why we haven't got the same number of staff. But if you've got 3 patients who are cardiac patients, well, you need the same knowledge base, the same number of guidelines, the same number of everything else as you do if you've got 100 patients. You can't just say, hold on, well, we haven't got many patients, therefore one person can do all of that lot just because it's pediatrics. And therefore that whole understanding of what pediatrics is from outside of pediatrics, I think it's still getting there, and the big centres are gathering. You've got a palliative care. We had the first, when I was down there, with the first discussions with Demelza and some of those centres. But it is about probing and trying to get those posts. It's not as flowing as adults is at the moment in terms of understanding how many specialities there are, and the fact that you need a different mindset for each of them if you're going to look at it as a speciality. And that leads to the research base, I think, and people really asking probing questions and then developing it. So it's sort of why I'm going the route I'm going, But I think they're the bits which are going to affect paediatrics the most.
It's an exciting place to be. That's what everyone needs to know and come away in terms of this podcast episode. It is definitely an exciting place to be. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have had this conversation. Thank you
Likewise,
for
it's
making...
been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Trying to remember back 30 odd years. Some of this has been interesting for the brain cells.
I hope that our paths cross again, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.